business, ukulele playing, baking bread. Almost all the classes are less than an hour long. Every class is split up into bite-sized lessons. Easy to fit Skillshare into your week, even if you have a busy schedule. I'm busy right now. And it's also makes it easier for like teens to absorb. And this is a good time to sit teens down. They want to watch a video. Now they can actually learn something. Skillshare has classes for every skill level. Whether you're wanting to get better at something, or you have want to get better at something you have a lot of experience with, or you want to learn something new, or somewhere in between. Membership to Skillshare at less than $10 a month. It gives you access to their entire library of classes. But the first 500 people who go to skl.sh/majorityreportAIT are going to get a free membership for 2 whole months. Put the link in our YouTube description and in our podcast description for Skillshare and our other advertisers today. Check it out. Do yourself a favor. I'm not getting appreciably better at the ukulele through Skillshare, but I'm getting somewhat better. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll be talking to Professor Walter Johnson on the broken heart of America, St. Louis, and the violent history of the U.S. Be right back after this. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It's a real pleasure to welcome to the program the Winthrop Professor of History and African American and African Studies at Harvard, the author of The Broken Heart of America, St. Louis, and the Violent History of the United States, or U.S. Professor Walter Johnson, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's start with why you focus on St. Louis. I mean, I know that part of it is biographical, and part of it is captured in a quote that you would tell of a reporter in the 70s. And I'm going to butcher the quote, but it was something to the effect of St. Louis is like a Eugene O'Neill play, not necessarily typical, but certainly representative of all the dynamics that can exist in a city.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, there's various ways of explaining why I came to feel that this is so important. I think that the one that you just pointed to is the one that I sort of learned as I was doing the research, which is that a lot of the things that we consider to be American history turn out to have happened in St. Louis. Whether that's the Missouri Compromise, the Dred Scott decision, or the first general strike in the history of the United States, or the first general emancipation, or East St. Louis race massacre, or, the major Supreme Court cases for housing rights, for employment rights, all came out of St. Louis, all the way up to Ferguson. And so as I started to research the history, I was struck by that. The thing that I learned in addition to that really is that St. Louis was the hub of the United States 19th century empire. And so hidden behind the sort of happy talk of the gate to the west and the architecture of the arch is the history of United States imperialism. And so what I came to see really is that St. Louis was exemplary of, and in fact, it was the site of the mixing together of U.S. imperialism and anti-blackness, and so that's what became the kind of defining idea behind the book.
I have become very just as I guess a little bit of a hobby interested in Reconstruction over the past year or two, and obviously to understand where you end up in Reconstruction, you got to understand a little bit of how you got into the Civil War. And what I found really fascinating about the way that you about this connection you found through St. Louis being the sort of the staging area for the Indian Wars, and that dynamic of removal of Native Americans carried over into their the perspective towards blacks in leading up to the Civil War. I mean, first, I guess, tell us a little bit about the history of it as a staging grounds for the Indian Wars and establish that notion of a removal policy. And then I guess let's talk about how that ended up implicating the perspective towards blacks at that time, which was also, I guess, maybe counterintuitively for us today, aligned with the abolitionist movement.
Terrific. So yes, I mean, there's a lot there. Let me see if I can, try and get through it without too many tangles. The first thing to think about is that St. Louis was the headquarters of the Western Department of the Army. And the Western Department of the Army from really the 1830s on was fighting Indian wars. That's what the Army did. The Army existed to fight Indian wars. And all of the Indian wars in the West, and even some of the wars in the East, including the Seminole War, were staged out of or substantially supported from Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis. And so, and that military effort had behind it a philosophy of ethnic cleansing and genocide, with which we're familiar. The thing that struck me as I started to write about that and then write about the subsequent history was the way that ideas about ethnic cleansing, about the notion of a white man's country, Missouri and the West as a white man's country, then carried over into the way that various elites and eventually the state of Missouri tried to govern free people of color and even responded to the institution of slavery. And so what I end up arguing is that there is a strain of anti-blackness, a Western strain of anti-blackness that is removalist. So you can say what you want about Southern anti-blackness and slavery, and it was disgusting and dangerous and deadly in its own way. But it's not removalist. The entire political economy of the South in the first half of the 19th century is dependent upon the presence of enslaved people, on the presence and reproduction of black people. That's not the way that many in Missouri looked at it. So there is a struggle within the state of Missouri that is effectively a class struggle between slave-holding whites and non-slave-holding whites. And non-slave-holding whites are interested in establishing a polity that they believe will be more equal between white people by excluding, at least at the outset, free people of color, right? That they're very, very threatened by free people of color. And so it's my argument, it's not only my argument, that it is that non-slave holding white Western view of the West as the white man's country that coheres into the free soil movement, into the idea that the fight with the fight with the South must be to keep slavery out of the West. The notion of keeping slavery out of the West is again not advocated because these people have any great deal of sympathy for African Americans, but it's because they believe that the absence of slavery will be the guarantee of white male equality. And there's a quotation in the book, I'm not going to be able to get it off the top of my head, but where a Missouri senator called H. Gratz Brown, who's one of the exemplars of this tendency in American politics, says, he begins to advocate for the gradual emancipation of enslaved people in Missouri. And he says, I'm not doing this because I like black people. I hate black people just as much as you do. I'm doing this because I love white people. I love white equality. And so what I try to suggest is that Missouri points the way to a kind of a white supremacist anti-slavery that comes to define a significant part of the Republican Party and the opposition to slavery in the 1850s and even through the 60s and on.
So, and just to be clear about the sequencing, and maybe this was these things were happening simultaneously. There was a segment of the white population that wanted essentially did not want slavery to take hold in the West because it would create wealth inequality, right? I mean, if I have a free labor force, right, I'm going to make a lot of money, and it's going to create a wealth inequality. It's also theoretically going to depress my wages, in some fashion. And they also did not want free black folk just simply out of their racism or as part of obscuring the class impetus in terms of abolishing slavery.
So a lot of fear of labor competition. But I think the other thing is that there is a degree of racialized class resentment. And so one of the interesting things about St. Louis is there's not a large population of free people of color, but there's a consequential population of free people of color, some of whom are quite wealthy. And so I think part of the underlying dynamic is that you have white people coming to St. Louis after the War of 1812, really beginning in large numbers around 1816, 1820. And as they get there, they encounter a kind of what I'd call Creole population, like a population of free people of color who have been there in families from the Spanish era and the French era. Some of these folks they're grocers, they are barbers, they are ministers, and some have fairly substantial wealth. And so the prosperous white people stayed in Virginia, right? I mean, if you're doing well in Virginia, there's no real need for you to move to Missouri. And so it's a kind of a striving, up and coming class of people who comes to Missouri, and I think that they then encounter a set of free people of color who are, in many cases, have fairly, strong social alliances with wealthy whites in St. Louis. And so that sets up a kind of a complicated dynamic of class and racial resentment that I think characterizes the period. And so then you see through the period before the Civil War in Missouri and in St. Louis, an increasingly kind of draconian set of efforts to curtail the mobility, the employability, and finally to drive out, to extraterritorialize the free colored population.
And this is a theme. This removal theme is something that sort of like is embedded in some ways in St. Louis's DNA, I guess, carrying forward. I mean, it's interesting because I would imagine on some level you could find an analog with the South, that the way that labor is treated today is in some ways maybe embedded in part of the DNA from the South and the way that they perceived slaves at that time. I don't know, but it's an interesting concept.
Yeah.
But
I tried to having noticed it in the 19th century, it was on my mind as I went forward. And what I saw really was a kind of a succession of efforts at spatial control and expropriation. And so the way that, when I looked at the East St. Louis race massacre, it certainly began as a conflict over black labor and over black men employed as